It's a privilege for me to be here with you today. Thank you very much for extending the invitation, those who did that, and for organizing this whole thing. I have quite a challenge here. I have 28 minutes to do what I normally do in about 4 or 5 hour-long lectures. So you're not going to get all of it, obviously. I want to begin, first of all, let's see, can we see? Okay. I guess we'll start the PowerPoint show up there in a little bit, but let me begin by telling you a bit about why I'm involved in what I'm doing. As the chaplain said, and I'm sorry, I don't have the name, the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is dedicated to addressing simultaneously 2 challenges: economic development for the very, very poor in the world. Think not of essentially anybody in America, but people in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, parts of Latin America. That's the first challenge, and the second challenge is good creation stewardship, taking care of this beautiful, beautiful, wonderful planet on which God has placed us. And the reason that we try to address both of those simultaneously is that very frequently public policy related to environmental stewardship turns out to have negative consequences for the world's poor by slowing their economic development, their rise out of abject poverty, and the very high rates of disease and premature death that are a normal part of abject poverty. Roughly 2 billion people in the world do not have electricity to their homes. Consequently, they use wood and dried dung. That's what I said, dried dung, as their principal fuels for cooking their food and heating their homes. The average sub-Saharan African woman spends 6 to 8 hours a day simply gathering sticks and dung to cook her food and to heat her home. The average American spends less than a minute a day worth of his income on electricity that provides cooking, heating, air conditioning, lighting, computer use, laundry cleaning, and everything else. So just imagine the difference in life that having cheap and abundant electricity for our homes makes for us. And when that average sub-Saharan African woman burns the dried dung and the wood on her open fire in her hut, typically with her baby strapped to her back, the two of them breathe the smoke from that. And the World Health Organization estimates that between 2 and 3 million, mostly women and children, die each year because of the respiratory diseases caused by that type of energy use. In addition, about 500 million more people get upper respiratory diseases that may disable them for anywhere from a few days to several months. Think about the impact of that on their economies, on how much they're able to earn every year to support themselves and their families. So consequently, we at the Cornwall Alliance believe that the provision of abundant and inexpensive energy is absolutely crucial to the rise out of poverty of the poorest nations in the world and to delivering them from the miseries that are the necessary and constant accompaniments of real poverty, not of comparative poverty, where we talk about the so-called poor in America, whose incomes are far above the incomes of the average American in the 1950s and hundreds of times above the incomes of people in developing countries around the world. I mean the truly poor, the destitute, those who wonder where the food's going to come from tomorrow and the next day after that, or maybe even the next meal. So our aim at the Cornwall Alliance is to try to help policymakers to recognize the connection between policies they make here and the impacts that those policies have on the poor in sub-Saharan Africa and other places. We have a sister organization called Churches and Villages Together. It arranges partnerships between American churches and remote villages in East Africa to do a combination of evangelism, church planting, pastoral training, micro-enterprise startup and development, and very basic creation stewardship projects like water purification, well digging, sewage sanitation, starting, say, a micro-enterprise piggery, a farm for raising pigs, and doing it in an environmentally friendly way so that it not only provides food, but also doesn't pollute the streams in the area. These are things that we do. But the trouble is that much policy here in the Western developed world can actually impinge on our ability to help the poor over there, or anybody's ability, not just ours, but any organization that is doing a combination of economic development projects and evangelistic outreach often finds their efforts frustrated by the either intended or unintended consequences of environmental policy adopted here in the United States or in other wealthy countries around the world. Just to give you a couple of examples, a couple years ago, the United States Congress passed legislation requiring a major increase in our production of ethanol from corn. We shifted a massive part of our corn crop out of the food chain and into our gas tanks. The rationale for that was that we were going to fight global warming by reducing our CO2 output. As it turns out, thorough scientific analysis indicates that if you include all of the energy costs of producing the corn, harvesting it, transporting it to the refineries, refining it, and then finally burning it in our cars, we were actually putting more CO2 into the atmosphere per mile driven than we otherwise would have. But let's forget that for the moment. The real issue was what it did to food prices around the world. Within months, we more than tripled the price of basic grains on the world market. Not just corn, but all grains, because grains are substitutable. That drove many people who were living on the verge of starvation over the verge. It's too early for statistics to be gathered well on the issue, but my prediction is that we will find that from even just a period of a few months that continued, there will have been 1 million or more deaths attributable to that policy around the world. That, I think, is unconscionable, and it's something that anyone with an Econ 101 understanding could have predicted. And the sad thing was that, unfortunately, many of our politicians either ignored what they knew or didn't know. So we try to alert people to that. Another example is that for many years there has been the effort to ban the use of DDT to control malarial mosquitoes around the world. We eliminated malaria in the United States, which, by the way, was endemic to 45 of the 48 continental United States up until the 1940s. We eliminated it in the United States by using DDT. The least expensive of all the types of insecticides that can be used for this purpose. Now we have developed other effective insecticides for that purpose, but they're much more expensive, several times more expensive. We can afford the expense. But various environmental lobbying groups around the world have for years suppressed the use of DDT, and the consequence is that malaria kills about 4 million people every year around the world and sickens hundreds of millions more every year around the world. When the World Health Organization lifted its ban on the use of DDT and said it's fine to spray DDT inside homes, on the walls, a small amount of DDT can eliminate more than 98% of malarial cases in that manner. When the World Health Organization lifted its ban, a variety of different green organizations around Europe told the leaders of the governments in sub-Saharan Africa, if you allow the start of DDT spraying we will boycott the purchase of fruits, vegetables, and flowers imported to Europe from Africa, which would have severely harmed the economies of those countries and contributed more to the poverty and the death that their people suffer. Consequently, most of the ruling governors of the sub-Saharan African countries have refused to resume the use of DDT, and so continued death from malaria results. Well, we are in an effort to steer us toward government policies, international treaties, and the like that simultaneously take good care of creation and watch out carefully for the impact on the world's poor. We have a particular project I'd like to tell you about. It's called WeGetIt.org. WeGetIt.org. I invite you to go there. We have a brief declaration that essentially tells policymakers we want policy to be based on good science, not on very, very speculative stuff, and that we want the policies to constantly look after the needs of the poor around the world. I'd invite you to visit that website, read the declaration. You can consider whether you want to endorse it. There are also some sign-up sheets here, and because you don't have the time necessary to think it through carefully, I'm not asking you to endorse the declaration. I don't want to take advantage of anybody by asking you to do that. However, you can put your email address on there. You don't even need to put your name, but if you put your email address on the sign-up sheets and put a check mark in the right-hand column across from your email address, we'll put you on the newsletter for the Cornwall Alliance, and that will keep you updated on scientific and economic developments related to these matters. Well, I have 17 minutes to go. Let me see if I can do this. I want to make a couple of theological points and then get into some science for you. One of them you sang about at the start of our chapel service today. And that was that when God had created all his creation, it was good. Genesis 1:31 tells us, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was good. Now, there are many, many things that we can get out of that. The fact that it reflects the goodness of God. Creation reflects that God is good. His creation is good, so is he. But particularly relevant to ongoing debates about environmental issues is this implication of that statement. Well, let me introduce it roundabout a little bit. Suppose that the architect who designed this gym had designed it so that a slight pressure put against one wall would set off a series of positive feedback mechanisms, i.e. all reinforcing and magnifying that pressure, so that you would get a feedback circle, so that you would constantly reinforce that pressure and build it and build it and build it, so that if I leaned against the wall, the whole building would collapse. What would you think about the architect who designed the building? Would you think he was extremely wise or pretty foolish? Well, I think the answer to that is pretty obvious, isn't it? Well, if you read environmentalist literature, one of the things that you find over and over and over again, and you can just Google environment and fragile together and see how many hundreds of thousands of hits you come up with. But the basic environmentalist worldview tells us that the earth is very fragile, that ecosystems are very fragile, that a tiny bit of monkeying with something can cause the onset of a catastrophic series of positive feedback mechanisms. Particularly in relation to the ongoing debate about global warming, the assumption is that by adding a tiny bit of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, we can set off a positive feedback loop that launches runaway greenhouse effect that causes dangerous warming of the earth. Now that assumption is, I believe, exactly contrary to what the Bible teaches us about how God made this world. He didn't make it fragile. He made it robust. He made it self-correcting, self-regulating. So that, no, it's not absolutely stable. It's never absolutely stable. No natural system is. But it tends to wiggle around a mean, an average. And that's what we find with the earth. So that would be one thing. A second biblical thing to take into this consideration is God's promise to himself following the flood. In Genesis 8, verses 21 and 22, we read that after Noah had presented a sacrifice to God after the flood, God promised himself that he would never again judge the world and destroy it with a flood. And I think, by the way, that the implication is in any other manner until the very end of time, in the last judgment, in response to man's sin. Because as a matter of fact, man is sinful. He's never going to stop being sinful. God says, I'm not going to do this again. And he says, as long as heaven and earth endure, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, night and day will not cease. Now, there's a Hebrew poetic device there called merism, where the opposites on continua represent, these and everything in between, all right? And I understand that passage as indicating that God has said that all the various cycles on which life depends are going to be sustained by his providential care from now until God ends heaven and earth themselves in the last judgment. Now that, too, I think, is contrary to fears that man-made climate change could bring an end to the various different climate cycles on which we depend and on which other forms of life depend for our thriving. Now, those are a couple of theological foundations. There's much, much more that I could discuss, but time won't permit. You might read my book, Where Garden Meets Wilderness. But now I'd like to go into just a bit of some scientific background for you. And are we ready here? Good, very good. First of all, global warming is real. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. At least it's been real many times in the past, but then so has global cooling. The chart that you see in front of you here comes from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from its 2001 assessment report, and it shows us a reconstruction of temperatures over the last 18,000 years, that is, since the last ice age. And of course, if you're a young Earth creationist, you're going to have to do some changing of how you interpret some of the chronologies here to fit it into your paradigm. I think that's an entirely legitimate thing to do. Our paradigms necessarily determine how we're going to interpret data. There are no such things as self-interpreting data. But this, anyway, is how the majority of the climatological community looks at the history of temperatures. You see a period there called the Holocene maximum. During that period, temperatures were much, much warmer than they are today, and it looks as if for the vast majority of ecosystems, that was the healthiest the world has been since the last ice age. You also see two small humps over toward the right end. The first one is called the Roman warm period, the second one the medieval warm period. Again, both of those are warmer than recent temperatures. Both of those were healthier times for the ecosystem and healthier times for human civilization. And then toward the end, you see what's called the Little Ice Age that lasted from roughly 1350 to 1850, when temperatures were much colder. The Thames River in London froze over every year. You could walk across the Hudson from New York on ice every winter. Greenland refroze at its outer edges. It never melted toward the inside at all. But you know, the Vikings had colonized Greenland during the medieval warm period. The colonies died out during the Little Ice Age because the glaciers came down close to the edge of the island again. It's been warmer before now. Total warming since 1850, roughly the end of the Little Ice Age, is about 0.6 to 0.8 degrees centigrade. And it hasn't yet brought us back to the warmth of the medieval warm period. Here are two different reconstructions of temperature over the last 2,000 years, and you can see in neither case do we reach the temperatures of the MWP. Recent warming gave way to cooling, and it's no cause for alarm. After the cooling of the last 5 to 7 years, global average temperature in June of 2009 had returned to its 1980 level. August's average was about 0.23 of a degree centigrade above the mean, but monthly anomalies can rise and fall considerably, making a century-long gain of about 0.7 of a degree centigrade unalarming and well within natural bounds. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but certainly by the way, if you would like to get a copy of this PowerPoint, email me, Beisner, that's EBEISNER, at AOL.com, and just ask for the PowerPoint presentation. I'll send it to you as an attachment, and then you can study it in more detail. The Earth has cooled for about the last 7 years. If you look toward the right-hand end of this, starting at around 2002, you can see the general downward trend. There are ups and downs through it all, but there's been a general downward cooling trend, enough to have wiped out, at this point, about half of the warming from 1979 to the present. Contrary to predictions, the oceans are cooling too. The NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies predicted the line there labeled GISS, as what ocean temperatures would do over this period from 2003 to 2009. They predicted a possible lower limit of the warming, and the reality, as measured by two different scientists, Willis and Lola, is represented in the two lines down at the bottom. Instead of warming, the oceans have been cooling. None of the climate models on which the UN IPCC depends predicted anything like that. The assumption behind global warming fears is that human emissions of CO2 drive global warming. But in fact, while we can have a rather steady increase in CO2, we have ups and downs in temperature, and in the last 7-year period, from 2001 to the present, the trend is steadily downward at the same rate as the warming trend that occurred before it over the previous 20-some years. That downward trend is opposite to the upward trend in CO2, which is very difficult to reconcile with the assumption that our human emissions of CO2 are driving climate change. Man-made CO2 emissions, in fact, have very little influence on global temperature. CO2's contribution to overall greenhouse effect is minuscule, and human contribution to CO2 is minuscule compared with natural contribution. Therefore, man-made CO2 contribution to warming must be minuscule as well. Roughly 95% of the greenhouse effect comes from water vapor and clouds. 3.5% comes from CO2, and the remaining 1.5% or so comes from methane, nitrous oxide, and other gases. Of the total CO2, 3.5% part, only about 117 thousandths of 1% comes from man-made CO2. That is a tiny, tiny portion and not sufficient to cause any dangerous warming. Furthermore, CO2's warming effect is not exponential or linear, but logarithmic. In other words, each new unit of CO2 absorbs less infrared heat radiation bouncing from the surface of the Earth back out to space, which is how the Earth cools itself, than did the last. There's an exponential curve on the left side there, a linear curve on the right side, but here's a logarithmic curve. A logarithmic curve starts out steeply and then it levels off. And that's how CO2 absorbs infrared radiation going out towards space. The sort of a blue fuzzy part in the middle there is roughly where we are now in atmospheric CO2 concentration. And that's around 385 parts per million at this point. That's near the saturation point. In other words, no matter how much more CO2 we add to the atmosphere, it can't significantly warm the Earth from that point forward. Recent studies show that so-called climate sensitivity is low. Climate sensitivity is the phrase used to refer to how much warming you expect from CO2, the greenhouse effect from CO2, after feedbacks, after the various different things that the climate system does to either increase or decrease other effects in it. I've just listed a few articles there that discuss that issue, but there are many others as well. Indeed, climate sensitivity is probably only about 1/6 what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change claims. 0.5 degrees centigrade instead of 3 degrees centigrade. That's the conclusion of a paper by MIT meteorologist Richard Lindzen and his partner Yongsang Choi. With no greenhouse effect, Earth's average surface temperature would be about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. With the greenhouse effect but no feedbacks, it'd be about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. In neither case would we have very good situation for life, right? But with both the greenhouse effect and natural climate feedbacks, it's about 15 degrees Fahrenheit, or I'm sorry, centigrade, 59 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? That means that climate feedbacks to the natural greenhouse effect are strongly negative, not positive. They eliminate about 58% of the greenhouse effect. But the fears of dangerous global warming all rest on the assumption that the feedbacks are net positive, not net negative. So it's highly unlikely that the climate models are correct in assuming net positive feedback. Temperature increase from doubled CO2 without feedbacks is about 1.2 degrees centigrade. With feedbacks, it's about half a degree centigrade. And no scenarios suggest dangerous warming from such a climate sensitivity. I must finish up quickly here. Temperature leads CO2, not vice versa. If you've ever seen Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, you saw a graph just like this one that shows there's a strong correlation between temperature and CO2. The problem is he gets the causal relationship backward. CO2 follows temperature, lagging it by about 800 to 1,000 years. The reason for that is that the oceans emit CO2 as they warm, but they're so massive that they take a long time to do the warming. If CO2 drives temperature, it has to rise before temperature, but that's not what happens. Natural solar and planetary cycles can explain climate change without CO2, and I list some there for you. As one example, consider the correlation between what's called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and temperature over the last 110 years. According to climatologist Roy Spencer, that can explain 75% of 20th century global temperature change. Here's a graph showing that Dr. Spencer has prepared. You can see much of his work at drroyspencer.com. He's not only one of the world's leading climatologists, but also a wonderful evangelical man and a very close friend of mine. Solar variance correlates strongly with temperature, CO2 not at all. You can see, just in this case for the Arctic region, temperature goes up and down while CO2 rises fairly steadily, but temperature and solar variance correlate very well. From these facts, we can deduce these three conclusions. One, while human-induced CO2 increase surely contributes something to global temperature change, it is not a significant cause of global temperature changes. Natural solar and planetary cycles are the main causes. Nature, not man, rules the climate. Two, CO2 emissions reductions won't significantly reduce future temperature because A, climate sensitivity is only about half what the IPCC claims, and B, CO2 doesn't drive temperature anyway. And third, CO2 emissions reduction policy will harm, not help. It will harm by driving up the cost of energy and therefore of everything else, because we use energy in producing and transporting everything, especially for the poor, for whom energy costs are a larger proportion of spending than for others. And it'll waste hundreds of billions of dollars per year that could be better spent on pure drinking water, sewage sanitation, residential electrification, nutrition supplements, disease prevention, and other actions that would have far greater benefits at far lower costs. Well, that's the end of that. I would close by saying this, that we as Christians need to exercise what the Apostle Paul commands us in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, to test all things and hold fast what is good. There are many, many different reasons why some people have an incentive to exaggerate alleged threats in our environment. Can't go into those for you now, I wish I could. But as my studies convince me, and by the way, as they convince thousands of scientists, over 31,000 American scientists have signed a petition called the Petition Project that says that there is no convincing scientific evidence that increased CO2 is causing now or will in the future cause any dangerous climate change, but there is huge scientific evidence that increased CO2 can greatly enhance the Earth's biological health, because after all, plants take in CO2 in photosynthesis and emit oxygen, and for every doubling of CO2, you get an average 35% increase in plant growth efficiency. 31,000 plus American scientists have signed that. There is no consensus that our greenhouse gas emissions are causing dangerous warming, despite the constant claims to the contrary in the media. I would urge you to be careful, to study carefully. And I would invite you to come to cornwallalliance.org and read some of our papers there, and they will refer you to many, many other good scientific and economic studies. Let's conclude with prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you for the amazing earth that you have made. I thank you for the delight that you gave me a couple of years ago when I first read an article in Geophysical Research Letters that showed exactly how clouds reduce warming at the surface and so act as a thermostat. What a display of the wisdom of our Creator. I would ask you, dear Father, to increase our praise for you and to increase our care for the poor of this world. In Jesus' name, amen. Oh, one last thing. I have some books available on a table out in the entryway there for you, for sale. And I would encourage you, too, to sign up to receive our newsletter. Thank you very much.